Hello, MRA Fam, my real Africanist. I am Maria Jew, the real Africanist, and I want to welcome you to my channel. I'm here happy once again to be doing what I love to do and what I think I do best, and that is talking and teaching about African history and current affairs. Also, disrupting the influence and control that Western academic and Western perspectives and scholarships have over the African story, as well as disrupting the negative way in which Africa is portrayed in education and media, but specifically education. And first and foremost, and most important to me, is bringing the African and African diaspora community together around topics that pertain to our common histories and our shared real life experiences. So I would like to first start by saying Happy Black History Month 2023. Again, I hope you are enjoying yourself. I hope you are taking time out to celebrate and acknowledge the accomplishments that those great ancestors that came before us made, so that we can be here doing the things that we love to do, right? That we can be here and exercise the God-given freedoms that are rightfully ours. I always say that freedom is not free. So that's something that we really have to pay attention to and not take for granted, and not let anyone encroach upon. I also first would like to remind you about the 28-day Black History Challenge that I put forth, which is named Can't Ban Black. And the Can't Ban Black Challenge is just for everybody to flood their social media sites, their social media channels with information or facts and figures about Black history. It's just my way of pushing back and resisting the bans that have been leveled at teaching Black history within the U.S. school systems. So I'm asking for those who follow me and also your followers and your friends to help us accomplish that. I think it's important that we have independent platforms where we can teach our own history and teach those things that are important to our communities. And that's why I am a big supporter of platforms like YouTube. I think it's one of the best things that has happened to independent education. And although I do have a degree from a so-called prestigious university, I am a staunch advocate of independent education, right? I think it was Mark Twain that says, I never let school get in the way of my education. So I want you all to keep that in mind. Organized school systems have a lot to offer, but there should be a balance. There should be some independent research and some independent studies, especially knowing the history of prejudice and racism that has tainted the Black story in education. Okay, so I got that out of the way. I last time on my video, I think I told you that the theme for the Black History Month celebration here in my town is Black resistance. Now, that may be the case in the United States in general, but here in my town, that's what it is. And I thought that was an interesting topic because Black resistance or resistance is such an important part of getting the story right, of changing the African narrative, right? We have to put up a intelligence resistance to those stories that are otherwise biased, negative, erroneous, subjective, and just sometimes outright fabricated, right? And we know that there is a history of that. And so we have to be diligent and we have to be intelligent in our resistance to these stories. And in our efforts to change the narrative, right? So the way sometimes when people think about Black resistance, most of the time they think about resisting something that is good for you, or maybe even a physical resistance. But everything, all resistance does not have to be a physical resistance, right? Sometimes it's psychological, it's a mental resistance to something that you know that is not accurate or that is not good for you. The definition of resistance is defined as the refusal to accept something or to comply with something. And so I think it's wise for us, especially for people of African and African diaspora descent, to push back and to resist those narratives, especially in education, that do not tell the truth about who we are and what our people have contributed to world society. And there's a way that we do that. You know, there's a way that we push back. It's not always protest. It's not always marching, you know, and which is also, I think, is a good thing. And it has been effective in a number of occasions. I know nowadays people they say, well, a lot of Black people, they say, well, it's time out for marching, right? That's an old strategy and it doesn't work anymore. Well, I disagree with that. I think we need all type of strategies, right? I think we need people marching. I think we need people at the table. I think we need people that are saying with fists high that, you know, we're not going to take this anymore, that we resist being treated as an underclass citizen, right? And we're going to take our rightful place in society. So whether that's in education, whether that's in employment, whether that's in just having access to services that are equal and that are just, right? And that we can do that also for ourselves. If someone else if the society in general refuse to do it, that we can do it for ourselves. But it's not that we're begging or asking for handouts, right? We are tax-paying citizens who rightfully deserves to be treated with dignity and respect and to have access to goods and services that our tax dollars pay for. And that includes a good and inclusive education. So we have to also be brave enough to push back against I would say, the orthodoxy or the acceptance of Western scholarship as the gold standard of learning what the African story is. I'm sorry. For centuries, the go-to scholarship and literary sources were all told or were from a European perspective or from a Western perspective. However, ever since Black scholars and educators have been able to write their own narratives, participate in the educational system, we have pushed back on these narratives that only come from a European perspective, because it's rightfully our duty and our responsibility to tell our stories, right? It's no one else's responsibility but ours. And that's not saying that that no one can study our history and tell the story, but it should not be exclusively from another person's point of view or people that are outside of this certain race, right? Because I know you don't see a majority of people of African descent telling the European story, or telling the Asian history, or telling the South American history, or even the American history, right? You don't see an abundance. I mean, there are plenty of African American historians, but with America, that's a different situation, because it's a melting pot of a lot of different ethnic groups and races that make up what we call America now. But even with that, we don't see a lot of the indigenous groups of people writing the American story. They concentrate more on telling their own story and what has been their reality inside of this country. So I just wanted to say that. And like I said, last week, I told a story about the first time that when I found out that Egypt was in Africa. And how surprised and shocked and really disappointed that I was when I found that out. I was in the 9th grade, and I was 14 years old at the time. And I was just amazed and really, like I say, just disappointed to find out after all that time that Egypt was in Africa, because Egypt and Africa was always taught as two distinct or separate places, right? It was never taught as if Egypt was on the continent of Africa. It was actually always taught as if Egypt was the continent and that Africa was a country, right? And that there was this, of course, this stereotype about who African people were, and then there was this stereotype about who Egyptian people were. And they were always royal and rich and, looking more like, I would say, Cleopatra the Seventh, right? The phenotype of the Egyptians that historians and, European historians and scientists and educators have painted as the original people of Egyptian civilization. But now, as time has gone on, we know better. And we know that the people that we have historically known to be Egyptian were not the original people of that land, and they were not the original people who participated in building these great civilizations, right? Because every time, I would say, even when we were learning about Egypt, we always learned the bare minimum, right? Because I think I told you last time that even when we were being taught the lesson about Egypt, we were studying Egyptian history. We were not talking about African history. But even when studying Egyptian history, we were just taught the bare minimum. We were always taught about, the Sphinx, the pyramids, maybe one pyramid, right, and about Cleopatra. um, they never went deeper than that. And so those things are pretty safe for us to know without associating them with African people. And like I say, Cleopatra, she was the representative of what an Egyptian queen looked like. But we know that I mean, she may have looked similar to that. I mean, I'm not sure because she came along. I mean, she's really insignificant to Egyptian history because about time when Cleopatra the seventh, again, she is the seventh, right? So about time she came along, Kemetic society or Kemetic civilization, which is a name for Egypt. So when I say Kemet, that's the original name for Egypt, which actually means the land of blacks, right? So she came along she was born in 69 BCE. So she came along over 2,500 years after the heyday of the Egyptian kingdom, right? She came along, centuries after the great step pyramid of King Josia, who was a um, a black king from the kingdom of Kush. She came a long way after that, so she's really is insignificant. But that's the image that they always want us to see. That's the image that they always put out there. They never, I mean, you never really ever hear them talk about Taseti, which is the oldest black Nubian kingdom that dates back to the 3500s BCE, right? And that's even before the dynastic period. That's within the pre-dynastic period. You never hear them talk about that. You never hear them talk about the rulers of that time. And again, to go back to something I said earlier, even with the name Kemet, we know that Egypt is a Greek form of the name Kemet. And I was an adult when I learned, actually, I was even out of high school, and I never learned this in college. I never even hear them mention the name Kemet, but Kemet means land of the blacks. And the people, the Egyptians at that time, or the Kemites at that time, that's what they referred to themselves as, Kemet. It was not anybody outside of that civilization calling them that. They called themselves that. And that name was taken from a black African king named Kim, right? So those are some of the things, again, that I say that we never learn, and we have to be studious, and we have to be diligent about finding these things out. And that's if you are interested in those things and interested in knowing the complete African history, right? They never mention the Queen Tai, right? Or Tai, right? It's spelled Tiye, and so people pronounce it Tai. It's pronounced different ways, but the point is that she was one of the most powerful and venerated black queens in all of Egyptian history, and she was born 1,300 years before Cleopatra was ever even thought of. Right? She ruled Kemet as co-regent with her husband. I'm sorry, Amenhotep III. And she was also the mother of Amenhotep the fourth, who is actually Akhenaten. You may have heard of Akhenaten. And she was the grandmother to King Tut, right? So Akhenaten was the first Egyptian or Kemetic ruler to abandon ancient Egyptian religious practices, right? So during his rulership, he changed the Egyptian practices, religious practices or spiritual practices from what European historians call polytheists, right? Meaning that they worship more than one God. He changed it to a monotheistic religion. But I mean, that is to be argued, because just like many other African religions, uh, Africans didn't think of their religion as being polytheistic. There's a negative connotation that goes along with that. And it's a way to label Africans as heathenistic in some form, like they believed in many, many gods. But they never really say that about the Greeks, who also had many, many gods, right? There are certain things that they only attribute to African people to denote something as being negative. But like in many African religions, indigenous religions that you see all across the continent, they ascribe certain characteristics to this overarching power, or this one omnipresent, omnipotent God. And so, but they would call him the God of this, the God of that, you know. But all of that was inclusive under the banner of this one God, of this almighty presence that we now refer to as God. But again, back to Queen Tai, like I said, of course, she was just a real one of the most powerful queens that there was at that time. And it is said that she was of Nubian descent. So of course we know that the Nubians were a dark-skinned African people. And it is said that she was, at the time, that she was, if not more, I mean, just as important, even more important to Egyptian civilization than her husband, right? Because rulers from other nations outside of the continent would write letters to Queen Tai asking for her assistance in resolving political matters, or asking for her advice and things like that, or asking permission to proceed in doing this or doing that, right? So she was really important, but you never hear her mentioned. I mean, you can tell me different down in the comments, but in my experience, I have never heard her name mentioned at all. There's another person that is very important to Egyptian history, and that is Imhotep. And Imhotep, and I'm quite sure you may have heard of him. Imhotep is popular in contemporary narratives and in contemporary entertainment, right? The stories about Imhotep. But again, Imhotep is always portrayed as this, I would just say, this fair-skinned person, especially in theater and movies and in entertainment. And that's not to say that there were not fair-skinned Africans. And I'm not trying to make a difference. I really don't care about skin color. Like I said, that's not my fight, because it's just not, right? That's not important to me. But for a person, for people, and for systems to try to rewrite the history and to try to change the ethnicity of who these people were is just as important. I mean, many people accuse us of trying to do that, trying to claim everything is African and make everything black. But I would say that it's just a pushback. It's a resistance to others who have tried to write us out of the pages of history altogether. But Imhotep was a black multi-genius. He was a physician. He was an architect. He was a scholar. And he was also considered the father of medicine. And it wasn't Hippocrates like we have been taught. Actually, these Greek scientists and educators came into Egypt to learn from some of these great Egyptian scholars, right? And these great Egyptian scientists who were the first, we would say, in recorded history. I'm quite sure there's probably some that preceded them, but as far as recorded history and as far as the evidence supports, the written evidence supports, they were some of the first, right? So that's a good place to start. If you are not really familiar with ancient Egyptian or African history, that's a good place to start. You can go back and do some research on those names that I gave you, like Queen Tayi and Imhotep, right? There's also another a queen that came out of the kingdom of Kush, which is rarely mentioned. I think a lot of times it may be mentioned in I'm sorry, when people are talking about religion or talking about the Bible, sometimes you hear them mention the kingdom or the nation of Cush, right? And it's automatically known that the kingdom of Cush was a black nation. But this kingdom existed between 2000 and 1500 BCE, right? So like I say, that was a long time before the ethnicity of Egypt started to change. And you never hear them talk about the kings and the queens of Cush. And although the kingdom or the existed between that time, there was subsequent kingdoms. I mean, the kingdom of Cush continued to exist. They may not have been at the forefront of Egyptian society at the time because there was battles. There was always battles, and they were always up against people trying to invade and trying to conquer their land. But they were a powerful kingdom, and eventually, later on down the line, they did rebound as well to once again become one of the major kingdoms in Egypt, right? So the queen Amaranthanes is how her name is pronounced. You never hear about her. You always hear about Rome invading and conquering Egypt, but nobody really talks about Queen Amaranthanes. Her name is spelled Manirenas, and she successfully, according to historical records, she successfully waged war against Julius Caesar and Roman forces, right? And she was victorious at doing that. She actually pushed Egypt back, right? And she actually held off the conquering of Meroe, right? And so the Romans army was eventually successful in conquering Egypt, but because of this queen and her the war that she waged against Rome, she was able to hold them back, also defeat them for a while, and they actually made secessions to the Meroic civilization because of this queen, right? So that's something to know. And like, again, you can go back and do further research on that. It would be interesting to learn your perspective on that. Like I say, this is a discourse. So I would love for you to leave some comments about this topic, and tell me some things that I don't know, or if I got some things wrong, I would love to hear your point of view. Okay. So on the last video that I did when I was talking about Egypt, I received a comment from a gentleman, and I thought, well, I believe it was a gentleman, but I believe that I would address that comment. So basically what he was saying was that Egypt is not an African nation. It's actually on the globe, located in the Middle East. He said that, so it's more of an Asian nation, and that it was the only difference, the only reason why it's not an Asian nation is that it was separated from Africa by the Suez Canal, which really didn't make a lot of sense to me, because that would still put Egypt on the African continent and on the west side of that canal. So I didn't understand that part of his comment. But he also talked about the artifacts and the statues should clearly prove that that Egyptian people were not black people, were not African, and that they were a sand color people that were mostly Middle Eastern and not African. And he also commented and said that he didn't understand why we as black people are obsessed with claiming Egypt and trying to make something ours that is not. So I was thankful for the comment, but I had to respectfully disagree with him. First of all, again, Egypt is clearly located on the African continent, right? And the Suez Canal is a man-made and it's an artificial canal that was built in 1858. So that was a long time after the Egyptian civilization as we know it, the ancient Egyptian civilization existed, right? This canal was built under a Frenchman. He was a French diplomat, and he built that canal. And I think Muhammad Ali was reigning over Egypt at the time. But he built that canal to connect the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, to make trade between Africa and Egypt. Between Africa and Asia, more accessible, more easily accessible for trade purposes, or so that's what was said. And so when we are faced, like I said, with these kind of comments, that's why it's good for us to know our history so that we can correct these type of assumptions. Now, as far as the color thing is concerned, we know that the Arabs that occupy, and the Arabs and Europeans that occupy Egypt now, they are not the original people of that land. Now, because there was a number of conquests and invasions that took place over the centuries that changed the look of Egyptian people. So the first people to invade Egypt, according to the work of Dr. Asa Hilliard, and that's was my source, the original people that invaded the land were the Hyksos people. And the Hyksos people were considered maybe an Asian type people, or Germanic type of people, or even some type of I would say a northwestern Asian type of people, right? And from what I understand, or from what my resources tell me, the Hyksos people were very militarized people. They added nothing to the building of Egypt's society. What they mostly did was invaded and destroyed, right? So they were the first to contribute to the destruction of Egyptian civilization, of plundering the civilization of their wealth. And subsequently, we know after the Hyksos, we had invasions from the Persians, and then there was the Greeks, and there was the Romans, then there was the Arabs, and then there was the Ottoman Turks, right? And from that list, it is said that only the Greeks were interested in learning, and only the Greeks contributed to building up Egyptian society, right? That they were the only ones that really didn't destroy and tear down but actually when they integrated themselves into Egyptian society. And by the way, Egypt is a Greek term. So when they integrated themselves into Egyptian society, they actually copied a lot of the progress and that had already been made in that society, right? And to until the Arabs came, I mean the Romans came along, and then the Romans conquered the Greeks. So a lot of times, also, I know when I was younger and when I was studying, we always think that these foreign invaders are conquering African people. And sometimes that's to the contrary. A lot of times there's already people that have invaded these societies, foreign invaders, and actually they are the ones who are succumbing to further invasions and conquests by other foreign invaders, right? So that's what happened in the case of Egypt, as far as the historical record dictates. So so we know that it was the um, Arab population, the Arab population, I'm sorry, that's in Egypt now is a result of those invasions, and is a result from Islam entering into Egypt in 639 AD, right? 639 AD, I believe, okay? Uh, Also, as far as the artifacts go, um, there has been a historical practice, a long practice of fabricating artifacts, um, making copies of artifacts, restructuring artifacts to reflect um, those to reflect Europeans, or those who have invaded, and those who sit to destroy the history and culture of the countries or of the places that they are invading. So that's not anything new, but specifically in Africa that has taken place. I mean, we should understand that the African continent has been pillaged, it has been plundered of a lot of their intellectual and cultural wealth. I mean, their institutions have been burned to the ground, they have been flooded. So it's really hard to recover what is authentically African. I mean, all over the world. Of course, we know in Europe and in America, here in the United States, the 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 universities and the museums are full of cultural artifacts that come from African nations. And the thing about it too, again, I just mentioned earlier, a lot of times we believe, well, why did we allow them to take our artifacts out, or how did they do that? What I've learned through my studies, which I found very interesting, was a lot of times, like I say, at the time, these societies are being governed or being occupied by colonial forces or by foreign rulers. So it's these foreign rulers that make these agreements or contracts with these outside entities that allow them to come into the African countries and take their intellectual and their cultural properties out of there. So it's not actually the African people that are doing that. It's actually these governments and these political leaders that are ruling these countries, these nations at the time, right? So that's the same thing that happened in Egypt, right? So during the reign of the British in Egypt, there was an excavation that was performed by George Reisner, and I'm quite sure many more that we just don't know the name, right? Or the name may be out there. I just don't know the name. But this one specifically, I know his name when I was doing some research for a blog that I previously did on Egypt. And so they were talking about how George Reisner, this blatant racist, right? was uh, commissioned by Harvard University and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to do an excavation, a number of excavations in Egypt, right? So Reisner was in Egypt between 1913 and 1932. So he was there for almost 20 years. And during this excavation, he took out thousands and thousands of artifacts that represented the Nubian people, because he was excavating the land and the temples and tombs in Nubia, and so that's the northern Sudan, right, and in southern Egypt. So at the time, both of these countries, or both of these societies, were under colonial rule. So he was in there with the permission of these governments who were ruling these countries at the time. And like I say, they said that it's over. There's thousands of artifacts and pieces that have never been seen by the public. And a lot of these pieces are gold. I was looking at some of the pieces that were on display in a recent, a museum exhibit that they had some years ago. Some of these artifacts are gold, right? So not only did they take out the artifacts, but they took out a lot of wealth. These artifacts were very important to these societies in documenting their history, but they were also valuable, right? And to make it so bad, these museums, they still have ownership of these artifacts and things, that these cultural artifacts that were taken out of these countries without permission. So again, a lot of times they act like they were given permission, but they weren't given permission by the people of those lands. They were given permission by these colonial leaders at the time, right? So that's a different thing altogether. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit, and talk about why we need to have Black resistance in the area of education. And I wanted to use that as an example, since I had already been talking about that, like I said, on the previous video. And so my response to my teacher when I found out about that was to question her, was to push back on that. I could have just stayed silent and accepted that and, been discouraged by that. But I pushed back on that. I asked her, why was this the first time that we ever learned about this, And tell me more. Tell me more about Egyptian society, Tell me, how could this country be on the African continent, and you yourself, I didn't say this to her, but I was thinking myself, you yourself as a Black person, as an instructor, continue to feed this disinformation to your students by teaching this subject in a way that is subjective, right? And which gives us no sense of attachment to this society, when this is actually an African society. So that's one way that you push back. And I encourage you, when you read a book, or when you hear a story that's on television, or that's in the media, I would say, or if you are a student and if you are in class, encourage your children to ask questions, to push back, to read and research, so they can have something intellectual to say. They can have a well-researched response to some of these bigoted and biased narratives that we still find embedded in our curriculum, right? So that's about all I have for today. And I thank you for listening. But before I go, I would also like to say that I have created what I call the aspect model. And I created the aspect model as another way of pushing back against this bias and erroneous and sometimes fabricated stories about Africa, or the negative portrayal about Africa in education and in media, right? And ASPECT, ASPECT, stands for the African System of Progressive Education and Communication Techniques. And it's a model that I created when I was listening to members of the African Union talk about what their vision and mission was for the African Union, right? And so what they wanted, what they said is that they wanted to make Africa a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner going forward. That was their 2063 vision. And I wanted to determine what could I do to help the African Union and the African continent and African people reach that goal. So in response to that, I created the ASPECT model. I decided to do something that comes natural to me, something that I am good at. So with the ASPECT model, it has 4 tiers. Within the ASPECT model, I create courses and curriculums that educates people or the world on Africa from a pro-African perspective, or a progressive African perspective, right? I don't talk about the problem all the time. I talk about the solutions. I talk about the progress that African countries and African nations are making, and how against all odds they continue to move forward. So I create innovative content around those stories, right? Around the positive aspects of our history and our culture, right? I also use the latest in for the second tier, the latest in research and technology to manage the reputations and represent the interests of African stakeholders. So whether that's African leaders, educational institutions, or just, like I say, African stories in general. And the way that I do that is that, I use technology to look out for the practice of using, or I'm talking about, I'm sorry, I get tongue tied. I get so passionate about what I'm saying, sometimes I get tongue tied, so please excuse me. But whenever I see that the story is being told wrong, or there's a negative African narrative, or an incomplete African narrative, or a one-sided African narrative, there is a technology out here that can identify those stories, and I can respond to those stories. Even if that's like writing letters, right, sending emails, right, challenging these stories, right, getting publications, getting media outlets to rescind what they were saying, specifically if the information is not true, is incomplete or is one-sided, right? I want to congratulate Ethiopia and what they did with the No More hashtag movement, right? That was right on time. That was right on the money, right? They all came together and they pushed back against these Western media sites that were reporting erroneous information about what was going on in Ethiopia at the time, and which was impacting or affecting their efforts in a negative way to quell the confusion and the situation that was happening there. So I have to give big shout outs to Ethiopia and their citizens for pushing back on that. And that is that's level 2 of the ASPECT model. Also, I organize public and virtual forums to elevate the conversations around African history, culture, and current affairs. So that's online, like I say, that's online or in person. If there's subject matters that we need to address between us, or there's topics that we need to talk about, I also organize forums around that, right? And the last tier of the aspect model is the preparation of teens and young adults to learn and teach African-centered education, content creation, and professional communication, right? So I teach young people how to tell the African story from an affirmative position, right? I also give them access to stories and information where they can learn more about the African story. So that's what I do with the aspect model. And I am available to talk to you or to any potential clients about that. So you can learn more if you go over to my blog at therealafricanist.com. And if you click on the aspect model heading, you can learn all about that. So again, I thank you for listening. I thank you for any comments that you leave or any part that you play in the discussion. I ask you to please like, share, comment, right? And hit the subscribe button. So whenever I put out a video, you can be one of the first ones to see it. Later on in the week, on Wednesday, I believe, I will teach a little bit more on this subject. So remember the Can't Ban Black 28-day challenge is still going on. So please post your Black History facts and information on your social media sites. Please use the hashtag Can't Ban Black. Use the hashtag Breaking the Ban. African history is Black history. And of course, the hashtag The Real Africanist. I will see you next time. And remember, fight the power. And there's always more than one side of a story. There's always two or three. Take it easy and have a good day.